He sells seashells by the seashore. Scrimsaw.
Scrimshaw.
Scrimshaw
Scrimshanders.
seashells by the seashore.
Scrimshanders are we. So, hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Thomas Shepard, your local reference librarian at the Clearwater East Community Library at SPC. Today for Unconventional Art, we're going to check out Scrimshaw. And we'll start with a presentation. But don't worry, there is no quiz at the end. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to speak up. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so Scrimshaw, which is the art of etching into anything from bone to horn to, in our case, shell, an image. It's very versatile, and you can use it with a range of materials. The word itself has a maritime history. So let's check out. Well, the art of etching an image into materials using a softer material, etching the image with a harder tool, goes back throughout human civilization. This particular one is Assyrian, and it's actually a little piece of bone that was an adornment on a chair. So it was kind of like someone's fancy chair. This may have been inlaid into the chair. And at one point there may have been pigment in the lines that were scratched into the bone. But this, I mean, essentially is the same thing that we're gonna be doing today. This particular one is from the 18th century BCE though. The word itself, scrimshaw, is part of a maritime tradition that goes back a couple hundred years. The etymology of the word scrimshaw, there isn't really a consensus, but many of the various resources about scrimshaw contend that the word is either English or Dutch in origin, and it means to waste time. So essentially, this was a hobby that mariners had during downtime, something to keep their hands busy. If we are doing scrimshaw, and we're all going to be doing a scrimshaw today, that makes us scrimshanders. So those who do the art of scrimshaw are scrimshanders. This particular image is, oh, by the way, all of our images today are public domain images. We found them at the Met and at a Creative Commons search, which is a great tool for public domain images. This particular 19th century painting depicts a whaler. And now whalers are a big part of the history of scrimshaw, or at least the sort of birth of scrimshaw. The ship you see, the black and white one in the background, is the whaler. At the time, this is the early 19th century, just after the Napoleonic Wars. The number one prey at the time was the sperm whale. And part of the sort of genesis of scrimshaw culture had to do with the sperm whale industry. I have an interesting little excerpt from the Encyclopedia of American Folk Art by Gerard C. Wertkin. The widespread carving of scrimshaw became possible after the 1815 publication of the Journal of U.S. Navy Captain David Porter. He exposed both the market and the source for whale teeth, causing a surplus of whale teeth that greatly diminished their value and made them available as material for ordinary seamen. So whale ivory, or sperm whale teeth, went from a luxury item to something that a sailor could spend his time whittling, or her time whittling. It went from an expensive item to a cheap item, something to have a hobby with. This particular image is from, oh, we got another guest, just one moment. This particular image is from the 1830s, and it shows your typical sperm whale hunt. There's probably a good amount of artistic license but it's a good image, and we'll take another look at this image later as we work on our Scrimshaw. So here are some examples of Scrimshaw on sperm whale teeth. Notice how they're simple line drawings and different values are created by scratching. These whale ivories are obviously tooth shaped, so these are traditional, very traditional Scrimshaw. But as the Scrimshaw culture has progressed, we've moved beyond things like ivory and whale teeth to things like horn or shell, or more readily available materials. Continuing on, at the time, sailors would use whatever tools they had at their disposal to create the image. Sperm whale ivory is a bit softer. I've never personally handled it, but if it's anything like faux ivory, or like if anybody's ever handled an ivory piano key, you'll notice that ivory is a bit softer than shell. It could be, you could almost think of it as like if you touch your fingernail, it's a similar texture to a fingernail. This particular object here is actually a sailmaker's needle. And you'll note that it's a lot more robust and a bit beefier than a normal sewing needle, because this was used to sew large sails. And for a lot of early scrimshanders, a tool like this would be ideal for creating scrimshaw. This particular one's from the early 20th century. Now, this is kind of a typical Scrimshaw image. Maybe there's not much known about this image. This one's from the Met Museum, and they have it from anywhere from 1830 to 1870. But we can take a look at it and sort of think about what the sailor might have been thinking as they created this image. Perhaps this is their hometown. Perhaps this is, they were missing their hometown, and so they wanted to create an image, or maybe that's the first port they visited if they were going overseas. Whatever significance this had, they created a really neat folk art image using simple line work. So as we think about Scrimshaw, we also come to realize that Scrimshaw is basically intaglio, or dry point etching. You are etching with line and image into a material. So before we get started today, let's take a look at some really good etchings for a little bit of inspiration as we keep moving with our Scrimshaw. So this particular image is from the 17th century. It's called The Moon in Its Final Quarter by Claude Milan from 1635. So when we're zoomed out, it looks like a pretty decent drawing of the moon. But this one is an etching. And I think it's probably an intaglio etching. So they used acid and etched in lines through a ground over a metal, and the acid etched the lines in the metal. But you could also create a similar image using line. And actually with our material, since we're using a soft material and we're going to be applying ink into our lines, you could actually create similar lines with Scrimshaw. So let's zoom in. Notice how they use straight lines in various thicknesses to delineate shapes. Like notice how the thicker lines on the right, you can either get rid of all the lines at all and create a lighter value, or make a thinner line and create a middle value, or make really dark thick lines and create a really dark value. It's another good example of intaglio. This one's actually from a cookbook from just after the previous one. This is the late 17th century. La Scala Moderna by Antonio Latini. I think I believe that is an Irish, an Italian cookbook. This is just a page from the cookbook of various ways to peel an apple, and or a pear, or some other tree fruit. The reason they used intaglio for this image is because this is a mass-produced printed cookbook. And at the time, this is the best way to make a mass-produced image over and over again the same way. So let's zoom into this image and see what they did with the line work to create these images. So notice how we're still using line. And here on the right side, the left side, on the right pear that's getting peeled with the H on it, to create the real dark shapes on the right side, they used cross hatching, which are those little lines that make little squares. And then to illustrate the curve of the object on the right, the other pear on the right, they went ahead and used line to go along with the curve of this line to create a texture. But stopping the line and leaving the white space also creates a highlight and adds to the three-dimensional quality of the object. Another image from La Scala. Notice how the artist used line to represent metallic silverware. And I think the artist achieved that by using an economy of line. So let's zoom in and see. So we used line, but we used it sparingly. We've got 4 or 5 real dark lines right here, 2 or 3 lighter lines, and then really gentle lines. Sort of a stark transition from dark to light. And that really gives the impression of a metallic object. If we look towards the finials on the bottom, you can see various lines the artist used to represent the curves in these sort of floral designs. Moving on back to our sperm whale image, which this one was also an engraving. This one was likely done, I'm thinking it was done on wood. Might be wrong though. But this, you'd see this one in a mass publication. This is also a print. But this image actually would be really good to reproduce for Scrimshaw. Because if we zoom in, we can really see how the artist used lines, just simple lines, to represent the various shapes, from the waves to the whales. The whale sort of color kind of created the rough, dark texture of the whale's skin with straight lines. And we also varied our lines to sort of differentiate different objects from each other. Notice how the whale's hide, I guess that's what you call a whale's skin is a hide. Do whales have hides? That's an interesting question. We'll address that in another class. But notice how this whale in the foreground, the artist used up and down lines to create a color value. And if we look over here in the background, there's another sperm whale doing sperm whale things, who also, the artist also used the same lines going the same direction, and it gives the effect of creating a particular color. So that juxtaposed against the dramatic curved lines in the water, like notice how there's not a single straight line in the water. So because there are barely any, there's literally no straight lines in our water, but our whale's color is made with straight lines, it has the effects of creating 2 different textures, and they really help each other stand out. Even back here in the background, just to the right, our right of the ships in the background, you have another sperm whale breaching the surface, and this sperm whale also has this sort of vertical line. Moving on, it's not all lines though. If we can sort of let the early modern era, or the modern era sort of inform some of our work, we can take a look at some. This is Camille Pizarro. He's an early impressionist, and Pizarro actually did prints. So this is an intaglio etching of sort of a pastoral scene of a country road leading back into a little town. It's all done with very loose shapes, and this particular print is made with a process called aquatint, which you use either something called rosin, which is like it works the same way as spray paint. So it creates a sort of foggy resist. So your acid etching will be able to etch the surface like little pixels because it gets in between the little droplets of the ground. But Pizarro, in addition to Aquatint, this is what we're going to focus on with Pizarro's work because we can use this in Scrimshaw. If we zoom in, we can sort of see Pizarro's very loose, very expressive line work. So if we look at older printings and etchings, they use a whole lot of straight lines and a whole lot of very equidistant lines. And that's excellent if you're trying to recreate an image exactly. But if you're going to be a little more freeform and a little more experimental, it's okay to experiment with very loose, very, I mean, you could almost call them sloppy, but it's sloppy initially, but because the artist kept the sort of same quality of line throughout the work, the entire work is unified by the line work. So let's zoom in a little more even. Real close, you see the lines are very expressive, and you see that the artist, you can really see the hand of the artist in these lines. And I think it does a great job of expressing the sort of chaos of woods, sort of a sensory overload when you're in woods. But overall, it creates a passable image that's fun to look at. And that's what we're about today. So before we move on to our tools, let's go back to the chat and we'll see if anybody has any questions or comments so far. All right, so we will go ahead and take a look at our work surface. All right, so in your kit, you received your instructions as well as, well, let's see what we got here. We got our instructions, we got a shell, and we also got our China marker. These are our instructions here. We also included in the instructions a few examples of line work. Notice how we can create any shape from, or any value from dark to light, curved to square, three-dimensional, cylindrical. It's just a fun experiment. Aside from that, what we need to start is, aside from our shell, our China marker, and our directions, we also need a solvent of some kind. In our case today, we're going to use some rubbing alcohol, basic rubbing alcohol. Hand sanitizer will also work. And that's something that a lot of us have lying around is our hand sanitizer. Then we also need a tool. So for Scrimshaw, your tool has to be harder than the material that you're etching. So it can be a number of different things. You could use a fastener, like a nail or a screw. You can use a hobby knife, such as an X-Acto knife. You can also use a small file. This is a little jeweler's file, and you can actually use that point to etch into your object. And you can also use, if you want to embellish the edges, you can also use it to embellish the edges. Another thing you can incorporate is sandpaper. Say if you start with line, actually this is a good example. I used a little sandpaper on this one as I was working on it because my lines weren't really, I decided to start over on a little portion. I actually had a little inscription on the bottom here. And I decided I didn't really care for that inscription because it didn't, oh, this is a C and an L for Clearwater Library. So that's fun. Down here, I had an inscription and I wasn't happy with the inscription. So what I did is I took some sandpaper and you can actually sand out the image, and that can be a sort of an eraser if you need to resort to that. But remember, you're removing material. So if we, not only does it change the overall texture of the shell, it will also sort of thin the shell. And if you put too much effort into sanding it, it could create a real, like a thinner material, and it'll break easier. You can kind of see that here on our schooner. I think the schooner was a lesson in taking it slow. So it's good to take it slow and work gradually, because in this particular image, I actually worked all the way through the shell. Might be difficult to see, but I'll do my best to just use our nail. Right here, we actually put a hole in it. So be careful when you're working on your shell. So now that we have our materials together, let's go back to the chat and see if anybody has any questions so far. Any questions, comments? All right, we'll keep going. If you have any questions or comments as we go, just speak up. All right, so another object, another tool that it's good to have around is a pencil, another mark making tool. What I did with my pencil. I think, especially when you're beginning, it's good to start with a drawing, and you can do that with pencil. I wouldn't recommend pen or anything that's not easily removed, because we're going to want to remove it once we're going to create the image. So I'm thinking for since we're at the library, we already made a nifty book on this one. Let's do a pair of spectacles today. So I'm going to go ahead and draw. Start with here's our arm of our spectacles. You can also use a straight edge. Straight edge will come in handy if needed. We're good without our straight edge for the time being. So let's sketch this thing out. See what we want our glasses to look like. Sketch them out a little bit. And so the reason I'm encouraging pencil, see if we can see this image a little better here. The reason I'm using pencil is because we can erase pencil, and it will erase right off of our shell. So we'll keep working on this image. Okay. Then let's make them horn rimmed here. Is that what that's called? Not sure. We'll make some traditional looking sunglasses with the real dark tops, or eyeglasses, because we need glasses because we read so much. Go ahead and keep going, and this will be a fun exercise. Since our other arm is going behind glass, we could probably try to make that look less dark. So basically we're going to make this area dark, this area dark, and then try to make this area light and simulate sort of glass by, I'm thinking we should add some line around the glass because we're dealing with a clear object. We also want it to seem like a different texture than the rest of the shell. So that's our image so far. Grab a sheet of paper so we can see it a little better. So to create different value, you can use a straight edge if you want. What I like to do, especially, let's start with, let's make a circle and make the circle three-dimensional. It's not quite a perfectly round circle, but it's close. We could have used our compass to make that, but so what I like to do is you want to follow the shape. So let me grab my pencil here. Let's say the light is coming from this way, right? This is our light source. So this part is going to be the lightest part. This part will be not quite as light, and this part will be dark. But remember, this object is round. So let's start with some line, and we'll actually use our straight edge. And we'll try to make them the same length and follow the shape. Now, this is just a scaled up version of what we can do with our Scrimshaw. And remember, this is just a demo of line work. It's at a kind of a bigger scale than this. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to use this on a smaller scale with your tool to create your drawing on your tool. So we have initial lines here. So let's create some more lines for our slightly less dark areas. Now, this is going to be far from perfect, but we'll see what we can come up with. It's going to look like a little planet almost. All right, so we've got, notice how as we move our lines, this area is going to get darker. So let's keep bringing lines out and see how good we can do. And then once I have a good amount of line going, you don't really need your straight edge anymore because you can follow the other lines. So I'm going to keep the lines going. Try to keep them as uniform as possible. Okay. Now the straight edge is going to definitely give it a cleaner effect. But see how we're with line creating a darker value, and these are just plain old lines. We're going to keep going, and the more lines we add, especially if we bring them from this side, the more value the whole thing is going to get. Bring these guys up a little more to kind of. I think we may have brought these ones out too far, but you get the idea. And we're using these lines to give this thing a three-dimensional. So let's not call this a circle. Let's call it a rock. It's more of a boulder because that's just how we're drawing. But you can see how the lines can make one side darker and one side lighter. So another way to create darker colors is cross-hatching. Let's make a box. All right. Okay. Now let's pretend like on our box, our light is coming from up here. All right, so that's going to be your lightest place. And we'll call this side our darkest spot. The one facing us. Actually, we'll call this corner the darkest spot because there's a little bit of light coming from here too. So cross hatching, to make things darker with your cross hatching, what you can do is just make your lines closer together. You can do this with straight lines, but you can also do this with cross hatching too. Especially, I like using cross hatching with, quadrilaterals and angular shapes because they complement one another. So we made our lines close together on this part. Let's make them further apart on this part. And it sort of gives the impression of a three-dimensional shape. Any questions so far before we start scratching? All righty, we'll keep going. So we can also create a curvy shape. Let's make a scroll real fast, like a sort of, we'll say like the end of an arm of a chair. So we'll start with a kind of a swirl, right? We'll call that, it broke off. So let's keep this going this way. We'll sort of start like that. So if you start with a shape like this, you can decide, let's say our light's coming from this way again. And you can use line to go along with the shape of it, not only the shape of it, but also sort of create a three-dimensional shape. We're gonna just put our low lights, our lines on the side that isn't getting any of the light. See if we can keep this going on the bottom here. But the lesson here is with line, you can create three-dimensional forms, especially with Scrimshaw, because as you work with this material, you're going to find out that the only thing you can do is use line. You can't really color. So if we want to create a real dark shape, like a real dark color, you're gonna have to line, and then cross hatch. And that's gonna create your dark value. So let's start working on our pair of eyeglasses here. So I'm just gonna use a hobby knife today. Actually, this one might be a little better, a little more robust. So our hobby knife. And then with this particular material, you're going to see that it has grain because it's a shell. I mean, it's an organic object. So you'll notice that it has various grains and various sort of layers. So what you want to do when you're working with this material is take your time. Be real soft with it. So start with a light line, because remember, let me do this in the best way you can see it. Remember that your tool is harder than the material. So you really don't have to press very hard. So you'll start creating a channel. And obviously be careful with your fingers, keep your fingers out of the way. But so when you're really, really coming down hard on it, you know, it gets more dangerous because you have less control. So it's better to start lightly and then find that same groove that you started and start again. So back and forth, even if you want to create a real deep straight line, you can go back and forth. This is kind of my practice show right here. But see, now that we have our line going, and this is, I found the best way to work with a hobby knife, such as this. So we've got our line going. It's pretty well formed. See how when we touch it with our blade, you can hear that. So what we're gonna do is make sure we have that line. We're gonna put a little bit of our China marker. Make sure the China marker gets in there nicely. And then also in our kit, we had our piece of felt. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put a little bit of my solvent on the felt, just like that, right? And then we're going to very gently buff until our marker starts to come up. And if your line's deep enough, your ink should stay in the line as we. So, and then you can always go back, see how my line was a little bit crooked, but it's almost like you're tattooing the surface. So let's keep working on our pair of glasses. And I'm gonna go ahead and just you can just watch me while I work. This is gonna take a few moments, but what we're gonna end up with is an image made of smaller lines. So let's get started. Go ahead and begin in earnest. So here, what I'm doing is I'm gonna start with some of these lines that are separating the real thin parts of the eyeglasses from the parts of the glasses that are clear. All right, but what I'm not going to try to do is I just want these to be plain lines because this is creating a sort of atmospheric part. And then something you also have to be careful with is there's actually layers on these shells. So it's best that your tool is nice and sharp. And, you know, if you end up breaking through one of those layers and some of it shears off on you, just go back over it again. Because you can adjust with the amount of marker you use. So right now I'm following the contour of the arm of the spectacles. Remember to keep your finger out of the way. So another challenge with our X-Acto blades is that it's difficult to make a curve. So now that I have the general shape of what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to scratch the edges of my arms the best I can. And you can kind of do it progressively. So let me show you on the big sheet of paper so you can see it a little better. So think of this as your blade. So you're trying to make a straight line that's kind of long, but your shell's grain isn't cooperating with you. So what I like to do is start light and go back a little more. So you start a little bit at a time and you go a little bit forward and take it slow. Because otherwise what will happen is you'll start doing this kind of stuff because your grain will catch your blade. So a little bit at a time, a little slowly is what you want to do. So let's keep going. So because the arm of these spectacles is kind of a challenging shape, see how I'm doing a little bit at a time? Make sure you can see that a little better. A little bit at a time. Slow, slow. Until we have our edge nice and clear. And you can kind of see how you can see it. So, and then once you have a good solid line going, see how I skated out of my line and it kind of created a, just go back over it, make it a little deeper. See how we're doing slow, slow. Keep going. And then I'll be sure and keep your fingers out of the way. But if you go slow, it won't really be a problem. So, and we want our arm of our glasses to be a darker color. So I'm gonna keep going on the rims of our glasses here. Try to get this shape going best we can. Okay. Now, this would be a good time to mention too, if you have sandpaper handy and you notice that your shell is being very sort of not cooperative, and you have a lot of thin layers that keep peeling off on you and messing up your lines, you can take the edge of your X-Acto blade or some sandpaper and sort of shave things down. Just create a little better of a surface to work with. So at this point, let's see where we're at. So let's grab our China marker. And remember, this is where we can go back over this too. So we're gonna put some China marker. This isn't gonna be your final image, but we're gonna put our China marker on there. We're gonna grab our felt. Okay. Oh, let's put some on our lines that we made around the lens too. And see how we're doing so far. Remember, circular motion, just let the solvent do its work. Okay, so we're just starting out too. And then, of course, our ink, our China markers, the pencil is coming right off with the rubbing alcohol too. But you can see that we're getting a start. So now this one, I think this is going to take a minute to really complete, and our time is limited today. So let's go ahead and let's grab our other one here. And let's do a more kind of a simpler image. Let me see if I can grind the surface a little bit before we get started. I have a burnisher here too. And again, you could use whatever is harder than the material to etch. So with my burnisher with a circular motion, I'm just going to kind of go over it, trying to see if there's any parts that are going to shear off on me. Yeah, it looks pretty good. All right, let's do a hand on this one. Let's see what we can do here. I think eyeglasses were Not the best choice, even though they were fun for the library, but they're, let's do something a little that we can see a little better. So I'm gonna draw a hand on here real fast. Let me see if I can draw a hand from memory. All right, let's see what we got here. The middle finger is the longest finger, followed by the ring finger, or followed by the index finger, then the ring finger, I think, but everyone's different. So I guess we're doing a little bit of foreshadowing on this hand here. All right, so basically just start with a drawing. Let's see, 1, 2, 3 segments in the human hand. So or in the human finger. So let's fill those in. We'll make this a little thicker. Maybe your duty eraser for this here. All right, so that's a good start. We'll roll with this one. So this image, what we're gonna do is we're gonna try to get our lines right on the outside. And then we're gonna make it 3-dimensional using straight lines like this. Okay, so we're gonna focus on the edges, and then we're gonna use lines to make our shape 3-dimensional. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and start with the edges. We're gonna go around the edges, and then we're gonna go ahead and use straight lines. And since we want to keep everything in kind of the same universe, because we're trying to use lines to represent light, we'll go ahead and do our best to keep our lines the same direction. So notice I'm going back and forth as I go. I'm scratching back and forth, just so our line stays in the same channel. You're almost creating a channel as you're, and then as you go, to make sure you're getting a good quality line, just run your blade over it to make sure that it's there. But you can also tell that it's happening because your line from your drawing is disappearing. And then another way to go about this too, if you're real confident with drawing freehand, is you can create a ground. Like you can create a dark ground and then work reductively. So think of it like a photo negative, right? And you can, like, the areas that you scratch into are going to end up being white, and think of it as a reverse image, like a photo negative. But we'll just work like this on this particular one. So I'm gonna go ahead and keep working on it from here. If anybody has any questions or comments while I work, feel free to speak up. And I'm just going to keep working on this, okay? Do my best to make sure that you all can see what I'm working on here. And you sort of, as you go, you sort of get little techniques together. So notice how I'm using my hand and my tool almost like a reciprocating tool, and I'm moving my object around, kind of like you would on a sewing machine. And this is very much a similar movement to a sewing machine, because I'm going like this. Just like a sewing machine has one motion, the needle goes up and down. But you'll get little random techniques together the more you work on these. And the shell is very brittle. There are much more forgiving materials out there, like horn. There's actually a synthetic ivory that you can get called micarta. I think it's micarta. But it's basically a polymer that feels like ivory, and it's a lot easier to create curved shapes. So when you're working on these curves, it's really easy to go off your edge like that. So if you end up overshooting your image, you can go in and scratch the line away. You can go in and burnish it with a burnishing tool, and that could be either a burnishing tool like this one is for printmaking. You can use the head of a nail, pretty much anything that isn't sharp. But remember, when you're burnishing, you're also moving material around. And with shell, you're actually removing material, because if you were burnishing like a metal would actually move and fill in. Whereas with shell, since it's such a brittle material, it's actually gonna just shear off. So, fingertips. All right, let's see what we got here. And you'll hit little parts of your shell that are really just a joy to work with. Like real soft. Like I'm in a spot right here that's nice and dense, and my blade is really just doing exactly what I want it to do. But you know, it's not always going to be that way. So. All right, finger, we're trying to make the third finger not look like 5 or 6 fingers. But we're getting there. We're getting there. All right, so we're almost done with our outline. I'm going to keep your fingers out of the way. So then when you hit your sort of rougher areas, then you can go back to your sewing machine motion or any other motion. Oh, that's okay. In the line. All right, keep your fingers out of the way. All right, so we're almost there on our outline. Now it's not going to be perfect, mind you, but we can kind of see the outline in the light. So at this point, let's add our little segments in our fingers. And then once we do our initial sort of ink, and we can really get that ghost image showing, then we can go ahead and work on really bringing out the highlights and the, well, in this case, it'd be the lowlights. So let's do one final kind of inspection, line inspection, and make sure we have lines. We'll go ahead and lay some China marker down here. And as you lay it down too, you can kind of see your image in white lines. So what you want to do is go over your lines directly to make sure lots of marker material, lots of wax or oil. I think this is an oil-based product, but aside from China markers too, you can also use oil pastel if you'd rather do colored lines. You can use acrylic paint, you can use oil paint, you can use printmaker's ink. The list goes on. Pretty much anything that will stick in the lines for us that we can remove. All right, let's get some rubbing alcohol on our felt. We're going to very gently let the alcohol do its work and do a circular motion. We're going to kind of create a some people use just magic marker too, but you want to test it first and make sure it'll come off with your rubbing alcohol. All right, get some more alcohol on here. Then sometimes your images might not be deep enough, but that's okay. We're just gonna buff it out. And what we're looking for is that last little bit of ink to catch in our lines. So the best way to do that is to come from multiple different directions. See if our finger can get a little better results than our felt here. All right, I'm starting to see some fingers, but another thing, so you can just start to see the tips of the fingers so far. It's going to be a very ghostly image, but we're not looking for a final image right now. We are looking for an outline to work with. So see how as we buff everything out, the remainder gets caught in our lines. Because when you're making these lines, you actually end up with a burr. So as you're carving your lines, the material ends up, you push a little material to the sides. There's a sort of cross section. So this is what, like as you scratch, this is a scratch you're making. So you're cutting material away or removing material, and then you end up with a burr on either side of the material. And you can catch your ink in two places. You can either catch it here, which is kind of what we want to do, working directly, or you can also catch it here on either side. And that creates kind of a fuzzy image. So let's keep rolling with the hand here, see what we can do. I'm going to go ahead and use my tool to scrape away some of the thicker parts of our marker, because at this point I have an image to start with. I wish the camera would focus a little better for us. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over my lines because I can really see them nicely, make them a little deeper. Switch it up. Let me grab my other knife here and see if I can get a little better of a Bring out the heavy duty knife here. Now, if you're really interested in intaglio and line work like this, I would really like to recommend an intaglio etching tool. If you go on, find online retailers that sell everything, just search for intaglio tool or dry point tool, and you'll end up with a tool that has two sides. It's not an X-Acto blade because these are passable, but they break. They like to break, which is why this is my third X-Acto blade of this particular session. So you're going to go through lots of X-Acto blades. But with your intaglio tool, you get a hardened steel with a nice thick point, so it's not going to break on you. And it's got you can really come down on it. And on top of that, your only sharp edge is the point. You're not dealing with this blade. So X-Acto blades or hobby knives aren't the most desirable tool, but they're what we got today at the moment. But it's because when you only have this is your only sharp edge, it's much safer to use and you can be more confident in your line work. So right now I'm carving my lines, but I'm also keeping track of where this blade is because I really don't want to cut my finger. All right, let's keep going on these lines. Now, your etching is going to be, it's not going to be clean and perfect when you're first starting out. Right now, you're finding your way through in your lines. You're creating your lines, and so once you have your image where you want it, you can go in and burnish. You can go in and clean. That's one of the reasons I prefer the China marker to something like a Sharpie, because with your Sharpie, you end up where you're if you end up using your Sharpie, it flows on nicely. A lot of people use Sharpie and Scrimshaw, but it flows on a little nicer, but it's harder to get off. So especially when I'm first working with an object, it's all about the China marker, and it's a little more traditional. The most traditional ink that you'd use is probably like India ink, but in our case, the China marker is pretty handy. But if you know your lines are where they want to be, and you're ready to really make it permanent, your Sharpie markers are great for that because they flow nicely. They're not as flaky, but they're also permanent. It's going to be a lot harder to get off if you put it in a place where you don't want it to be. All right, I think we need some of these. I don't know what the nomenclature is for these wrinkles. So let's put some wrinkles in this hand. Just like that. And see, when you have your pencil handy, you can just add and remove. So let's we're gonna use this X-Acto blade for this. See, I'm coming into some different texture here, a little bit of pockets of sort of brittle parts. So be on the lookout for that. That's why we take it slow. So let me try one of my little jeweler's files. I'm gonna go ahead and use the tip of it for this other line and see how it does. Oh, that one's nice. It's okay. So again, case in point, as long as your tool is harder than the material you're carving into, you're good to go. Some tools are better than others, though. going to go back to my X-Acto blade because that's giving me a little better results. All right, we'll keep that line going. All right, we got segments in all of our fingers. All right, so let's do some horizontal lines here to sort of get this thing to start being a little more three-dimensional. So I'm going to do another, I'm going to wipe down again, wipe my China marker down a little bit. Try to clean this thing up. Don't be afraid to really get in there. All right. A little part that's giving me trouble right here. So if you get a really strong part, you can just really get in there and circular motion, let the felt do its thing. But some of those lines that I just made are actually showing up. Kind of see your hand there. And that part that I was mentioning that was brittle, we actually went on right through the shell. So that's what I get for not taking it slow, but it's okay. That's actually kind of neat. That's almost a feature. We'll keep moving with it. So let's add some horizontal lines to our hand. All right. So I'm just going to do the edges because I want this image to be very kind of simple. There goes another. So also something to think about as you work is these ribs. So if you look closely at the cross section of the shell, you got thick parts and thin parts. But when you're inside and you have the flat part of that is going to be thinner and part is going to be thicker. So it's best to work lightly. So let's go ahead and keep these horizontal lines going. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep my horizontal lines on just one side of each finger. And that will sort of simulate a light source. We don't have the most time in the world today, but then when we're done here, we can go ahead and talk about other materials that are a little more forgiving than our shell. And I feel like I'd like to keep Scrimshaw going. A lot of possibilities here. All right. A couple more lines here. So as you're working, another thing to think about is, say you have a place where you really like where your line is, you want to leave it alone. It's okay to not ink the line or not put your China marker on the line. So let's go ahead and see how we did here. Clear off our dust. We'll go ahead and really try to get the ink in the places where we just worked. And you want to go with the cut you made. So that material from the marker goes right into those spots. All right, highlights of this hand going here. See, our felt's nice and saturated. See how we're doing here. And so you can do the same thing with, different colors of China marker. You can try different colors of Sharpie, you know. So in fact, kind of like the way my fingers are looking. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna try to get as much of this China marker off as I can. And I'm gonna use my Sharpie to kind of make it a little more permanent because I really like where my lines are right now. Grab a Sharpie. Notice how when you use a combination of Sharpie and the China marker, your Sharpie is going to have kind of a blue tint, but that's okay. We're basically tattooing the lines we made. Let's get all these lines in here. Just for speed's sake, just so we can look at an image. All right, let's see what we got. Oh, very nice. So we can really start seeing that hand come through. And then we have a little area right here where we could burnish, kind of get an area where you're, you know, where your ink is sticking. Sometimes the texture of the shell will pick up ink where you don't want it to pick up. So you can take the side of your knife if you're working with an X-Acto knife and just really get in there and take it out. So let me go ahead and okay, and then we'll go ahead and throw some Sharpie into those lines we just made. I think we need a little more line on the middle part of the palm here. All right, so let's get a little more rubbing alcohol on here because we really want to clean it up. There we go. Looking good. Try to get it a little bit more cleaned up. Camera doesn't really do it justice, but you can really see the image starting to take form, and when it's in a shell like this too, it just adds to the drama, I'd say. And if we end up removing more ink than we intended to, you can go back over it again until you get the desired result. Really get in there. So it's a start. I'm really curious to see what everyone else is working on, and I would like to try this again with a different material too. As far as a more forgiving material to do something similar to this with, I'd like to make a quick recommendation. This book is available here at the Clearwater East Community Library. It's actually called The Complete Book of Gourd Craft. Let me go ahead and take a brief break and clean up for a moment. And I'd like to share this book with you real fast. All right, so this particular book is the complete book of gourd craft by Ginger Summit and Jim Widdeth. It actually has a section where you do scrimshaw essentially with gourds. I'd recommend trying gourd craft. Come check it. Come take a look at this gourd craft book. It's a great way to practice and a great way to do that line work with the additional ink. But is there any questions before we finish up today at all? Any comments? All right, well, thank you very much for coming today, and I'm curious to see what you all do with your shells. Thanks again. Have a great weekend.